Welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are deep diving into the stories dominating our world. Today, I'm excited to bring on Narrative Dive Danetha Doe, who is an economist, entrepreneur, and thought leader in luxury entrepreneurship. She's passionate about advancing economic empowerment, women's entrepreneurship, and sustainability. She is a former NFL cheerleader turned Webby Award-winning TV host. Danetha bridges the worlds of luxury and innovation through her work. She is the founder of Power Glam Productions, an intellectual property house sculpting the future of elevated economies. Through its brands, the organization supports luxury founders, legacy investors, and visionaries who are interested in shaping future economies rooted in pleasure, power, and poetic precision. Who wouldn't want that? Danetha is an international speaker with the U.S. Department of State, where she collaborates with embassies and consulates to promote economic inclusion and prosperity globally. Her expertise includes guiding entrepreneurs in the luxury market to scale sustainably and secure capital while maintaining exclusivity and impact. She has been honored as one of the 100 most influential financial experts and one of the top 5 Black personal finance experts to follow. The Office of U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, this is awesome, recognized her contributions to Caribbean American culture and heritage with special congressional recognition. The Hong Kong Institute of CPAs has also named her a millennial thought leader. Danetha holds a Bachelor of the Arts degree in economics from DePaul University. Danetha, welcome to Narrative Dive. I'm really excited about this conversation, especially talking about luxury brands.
I am so delighted to be here with you, Jessica, and I'm looking forward to wherever this conversation takes us.
I love that. Open-minded. Okay. So first things first, how important is storytelling and crafting a pitch for a founder? Seems like an obvious question, but I'd love to hear your take on this.
I believe storytelling is the pitch. It is the way that both the investor and the entrepreneur can determine if there's alignment. Rather than simply focusing on spreadsheets and metrics, which of course are necessary as well, it's the story, though, that drives the resonance between the two individuals.
That makes a lot of sense. So on your podcast, you uncover the stories behind iconic brands and decode their strategies for staying profitable, relevant, and aligned. How does a story, taking this a step further, raise a brand's status to being iconic? What makes an iconic brand?
From my perspective, being iconic is synonymous with cultural capital. The brand has solidified itself as a necessary piece of the culture's fabric. And that's going to outlive the founder, outlive perhaps the brand as well, and be interwoven in a way that we all feel it, may not necessarily be able to name it, but it's there embedded in the culture.
Can you give us some examples of this?
One that comes to mind, which is something that I'm diving into in terms of how to structure intellectual property around this, is Victoria Monet, who is an R&B artist. And she, 2 years ago, decided that brown was going to be the color that she led with. So every aspect of her aesthetics was brown. 2 years later, just this year, Pantone named that same color brown as the color of the year. That is something that Victoria Monet embedded into our culture. How do we track that? That's something that I'm playing with. I don't know Victoria personally, so that's something that I'm doing a deep dive on in terms of there could have been an economic structure around her and her team's decision around that mocha brown that's now infused in our culture. How could she have capitalized upon that? How could she have incorporated that into her brand? That's what I mean by when someone or a brand becomes iconic, it's infused in the culture in the way that not everyone's going to pick up on where the origin was, but they were the genesis of it.
I also remember images of Coca-Cola from the 1960s and 70s being this, which is not a luxury brand, obviously, but it just projecting this image of like the happy America, the suburb. And when you think about having a bottle of Coca-Cola, you have this association of like idyllic suburban life in many ways, at least for the American psyche.
Well, I love that you brought up Coca-Cola because it is a nice contrast to luxury brands because Coca-Cola is mass consumer. It's an institution that's been recognized and they don't have to necessarily think to the nuts and bolts of how do I monetize this image that I've put out, this idyllic suburban lifestyle, because they have an institution behind it that's going to allow the brand to benefit and capitalize upon that imagery. The luxury brand owner, the artisan, the craftsmanship, the Victoria Monets of the world, they aren't institutions like that Coca-Cola. So there has to be a little bit more thought, a little bit more finesse around how do we ensure that the genesis of that imagery always is compensated for what they've embedded into the culture. So that's why I focus on luxury brands because they tend to be forgotten in that capital conversation.
Interesting. So you had your first in 2014 boutique fashion designer client, and you witnessed, was it 15,000 in capital raise? And you talk about in your materials, like on your website, how you realized that the entire funding narrative needed to be rewritten through that client in particular. How did you come to that realization? Can you talk a little bit about how that deal was structured and what you found out?
Yes, and $50,000 to me at the time was a lot of money. It was a huge win. Since then, I realized, oh, there's a lot more money out there to be had as well. But at the time, 15 grand was a lot, and it was a big win for us. And it was a big win because she had a mobile fashion truck that was doing very well, and she wanted to move into a brick and mortar space. So she needed some capital in order to secure the location, hire a part-time manager so that she wasn't there 24/7. And she had a lot of financial success with her mobile fashion truck. She was a pioneer in that space. Even food trucks weren't as well known in 2014. And so when she would present to lenders and sometimes investors, there was always a blank stare. They didn't understand what this business model was, even though she was clearly profitable. They just didn't see the vision. And that experience of working with her, where she had the passion, she had the numbers, she had the profit, and was still getting no's, that's where when my eyes opened up to the system needs to shift because she's bringing everything that investors say they want to the table, and they're still saying no. In her case, we ended up finding an alternative financing lender, so a company called Kiva that provides 0% interest loans. And that's where my mind opened up to, oh, it's not just banks, it's not just VCs even or angel investors that can provide capital. There are these alternative models that are propping up that will allow founders who have a huge vision, have the willpower to make it happen, and give them access to capital in unique ways. Since that experience, I did a lot of thinking around what is the psychology behind this system. And the psychology is that the investor is seen as a god, and the entrepreneur is seen as someone that's just begging for pennies. When really it should be reversed. The founder is the one that's putting in all the sweat, the time it takes to dream, the risk. And the investors should feel so lucky to be involved in their dream, in this journey. And that's what needed to shift. And that started to inform the way that I worked with founders and what I do as an economist to shift the system behind financing.
You are absolutely right. I had a personal experience with that in 2016, 2017. I was through Northwestern and Chicago participating in a accelerator for very early stage startups, and mine was a dating app called Muse that was event based. So, and everyone knows dating apps suck these days. It's all over the media. There's so many millennials complaining about how they're disjointed, and I had reinvented one to make sure that people could meet around shared interests versus just, having a drink off of a picture on an app. And having to pitch this to a board of over 50 white guys, pale, stale, and male, nice guys nonetheless, but they really did not get why the product was necessary, nor were they my target audience for the product either. But that is true. You do really feel like that as a founder. You often feel like you're pushed into this narrative corner where it's like I'm asking people for money and therefore I'm subjugating myself because I'm asking people for money. But the reality is these people are vying to invest in something that could be the next biggest thing, biggest revolution in dating or biggest revolution in luxury products, for example. So that narrative shift is very important. I do definitely understand that. What other roadblocks exist for talented founders to get the funding that they need to grow their venture? I find it really interesting that you went through Kiva. For anyone who isn't aware, Kiva is this super awesome organization that provides microloans to entrepreneurs around the world. I think there's zero interest, right? Or maybe there's some interest. Yeah, zero interest microloans. And this has enabled thousands of entrepreneurs in every corner of the world to be able to launch businesses or products that they otherwise could not get funding for. So it's so fascinating that you went through Kiva. I really respect that organization. Going back to my original question, what roadblocks exist for these founders to access the funding they need beyond what we've already discussed?
I love your Muse dating app concept because I do find that securing financing is a lot like that process. And I feel and have seen and know that the other block is connecting with aligned investors. When I say that, and investors finding founders that are aligned, it's like dating. They're both looking for each other and can't seem to find one another. So something where their shared interests, like an event-based dating app, where they can connect based on what vision they each have for the world, seeing that it aligns. The founder's done the hard work of creating the product, the business, in order to bring that vision to fruition. The investor, to their credit, has the capital. They've done whatever work they needed to do in order to have that capital. But that's the other big block is folks with aligned visions actually finding each other. Um, Maybe it's a dating app that needs to be created in order to do that.
Did we just invent a product here?
You may have. It only took a few minutes too.
That's incredible because a light bulb just went off when I was talking to you, and I thought, how easy would it be? Because if you're a VC, right, you're sitting through pitch after pitch after pitch, and I'm not sure. I guess depending on your fund, who's vetting the people coming through the door? Is it some people do funds around green economy or women, particularly? They have a theme. Some don't. But you're totally right. It's that a lot the values alignment when it's not there. Just, I mean, someone who's been married for 25, 30 years is not going to understand the perils of millennial dating that and I'm pitching to that person trying to convince them to understand it. And they just don't, they just won't because it's not their lived experience. So yeah, I think that is a product that is necessary. We can definitely talk more about that. You've often referred to yourself as a glamour economist, which I think is really cool. Could you tell us what that means?
Yes, Glamour Economist I chose intentionally. And I base my philosophy, my research, my analysis of economic systems around beauty, desire, and passion. I fully believe that if we build economic systems, economic policies, frameworks around those three things, we would have a world that most people want to live in. Even if my passions and my desires may differ from yours, Jessica, I think we both want to live in a world that is drenched in desire, drenched in pleasure, where folks are fully self-expressed. And that's what I mean by glamour economist.
I think you're right. Some would say that sounds somewhat hedonistic, but at the same time, what fuels you in life? Passion. What inspires you? Beauty. What motivates you? Power. So, all of these intrinsic human qualities that help us survive and that make us want to survive, they're actually evolutionary traits, are an exact match to that. So, that's not bad. Your focus on the luxury market, it really operates on fundamentally different principles, and we've touched on some of those than like a typical venture-backed startup, right? It's not your Swiss Army knife of to-do list apps or calendar apps, for example. How do and for some those of us who've studied economics, how do the narratives around the exclusivity and the rareness and the craftsmanship and the legacy of using one of those brands conflict with traditional scaling stories? Because a lot of founders love scaling stories. How do your founders navigate this?
Yes, I will say a lot of founders love scaling stories because that's what they've been fed from investors. And investors have been conditioned to want to find the next unicorn, hit the ball out of the park, get a grand slam, whatever terms they're using now, I don't know. But the fundamental difference is that luxury brands and businesses are based on craftsmanship, heritage, legacy. Those are fundamentally different metrics that we're going to analyze than if it's a Swiss Army knife type of business where the goal is how many people can we get through the door? How many people can we get to purchase this product versus what is the legacy that this business is leaving behind? I love to use an analogy that I think I first heard from Oprah in one of her many inspiring talks. The idea that as an investor, can we think about planting a tree knowing that we won't be the ones sitting under the shade?
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
Yes, it's social responsibility. For some folks, that may scare them away because that's not something they want to think about. But think about all the museums that you go to that are funded by folks who are no longer here. In Portland, there's cherry blossoms that were planted during World War II. Those folks that made that decision never got to see the full bloom of those cherry blossoms, but it was in honor of the relationship that they needed to mend with the Asian community. And so now we get to see this beautiful expression of solidarity that folks that did that work never got to see. But I believe that that's a beautiful way to live life where I get to benefit from decisions that folks made that they never got to see the full expression of. And then I get to do that too for future folks.
Yeah, that really resonates with me because I was living in Germany for a couple of years, which I have ancestry in that country. And my favorite term in German is Vorfahren, which means like those who drove before you. And so when you think about that term, you think somebody carved a road or a path before you so that you had a path or a road to drive down yourself. And it's interesting to put that in the context of brands because some brands like Levi Strauss have been around for 100 years or more, right? And it's like how have they impacted the social fabric, the values and beliefs of our culture, like you mentioned earlier. It's really interesting.
I love that term. The Germans are so great at that, having specific words for very specific topics.
Definitely, for sure. We we've been talking a lot about values and by definition, for anybody who's confused on this definition, values are usually a belief that something is good or desirable and worth striving for. So regardless of the context or circumstance, your value might be a solid family life. Your value might be integrity, and that no matter what the circumstances, you will always strive for that. So, that said, and that being defined, why is it so important for a founder to find a values aligned investor?
It's everything because not only is it about securing capital, but it's also about ensuring that whomever the founder has decided to receive capital from, that they are not going to eventually drain their energy. If it's like a marriage, folks that raise money have heard that before, that you want to think about this like you're going to into a long-term romantic relationship, and you need to ensure that the foundation is solid. And a solid foundation, whether we're talking about securing capital or securing a loved one, is, are our values aligned? Do we see the world the same? Do we have the same vision for the type of world we want to live in? That doesn't mean everything's going to match up perfectly all the time, but if we can always come back to that, then we can ensure that the conversations, when we do hit roadblocks, when there are challenges, that there's reverence already established because we know that our North Star is similar, it's aligned.
It reminds me somewhat of, I think it was Elvest that had ways you can invest in women-owned, a fund that invests in women-owned businesses, and then they have green energy funds where you can invest in companies doing green energy. So this trend of values investing is probably going to spread more and more in the coming decades because we've seen the mistakes with the system when values are not aligned, right? There's corruption, there's lies, there's exploitation, and have reached their, I would say, their fill with that part of capitalism. So it's time to make capitalism start working for us in that regard. You have something called the legacy circle, and you've described it as a cultural intervention that reimagines who holds the power in the capital process, how wealth is shaped by narrative, and what it means to create a business that's truly in integrity. Can you tell us a bit about the legacy circle?
The legacy circle is a term that was birthed out of the philosophy I started to dive into back with my first client in 2014, where I realized the power dynamics needed to shift. The investor is no longer the god. If there is a god, it's going to be the vision. And both the founder and the investor are serving in service to the vision. And the legacy circle is the framework that the founder uses in order to determine if this investor is someone I want to invite into my circle. Just like as individuals, we have an inner circle, chosen family members, the founder is the one who chooses if this investor is worthy of being on this glorious journey and to be given the opportunity to have a legacy that outlives them. So the legacy circle is that. It's the invitation to the investor.
So that's an important intervention to have, because the normal process that a founder follows, for anyone who hasn't attempted this, don't try this at home, is creating a pitch deck, attending investor meetings, making a pitch or a case for your product or your business worth. Like, what is this worth? How, let's talk money and change and TAM and audience size and all of these metrics. And then they're just kind of hoping that they get funded, like we mentioned earlier. Starting with the invitation for a values alignment, from my perspective, and I wish I had had this when I was pitching mine, would kind of push away any naysayers who don't already understand the founder's vision.
Yes.
So yeah, that's how I would see it.
Exactly. And since you've had intimate experiences with this, then you know the emotional drain that happens when you are in a room with folks who do not understand and don't want to understand. And you're spinning in circles trying to convince folks. And then what that does to the founders, they start to dilute their brilliance. They start to compartmentalize what they've thought deeply about to fit whatever narrative is in front of them. And that takes away from, again, the brilliance that they've already done the work to figure out how this business is supposed to work. And this shift into thinking of investors as legacy circle means before you step into the room if it's worth your time going in there. And that energetically also clears the deck for the investors who are in alignment to find you.
That is so important, because I remember when I was doing pitching, we had to do so many of these pitch workshops and everything. The comments that I would get were, why would someone need this? I don't really see the point of this. And I'm going, have you used a date? So I remember one day raising my hand going, have any of you sitting in this room used a dating app in the last 5 years? No one raised their hand. So of course, they don't understand why I'm needing to make these changes. When you are a founder, and any founders listening to this may empathize, but when you start having so much no's and so much criticism and with people who don't really understand your vision at all, it starts affecting your self-esteem and your self-worth, and your self-doubt props up, and your idea may be a fabulous idea, but you start questioning, am I good enough? Is my idea good enough? Is this worth it? Is this worth my time? And that can be very disheartening when you're trying to really champion something that could change the world in a massive way. Imagine if the Facebook in its early days had gone through that many hurdles, then it probably never would have been invented. Our whole platform revolution may have been slower to happen. There's many things that the world would not have had, good and bad. That's a whole nother podcast episode, but that would not have happened had this brand not come into existence, and many brands or products and services after that.
I do want to say, I love that you brought up the Facebook example because I wonder if there was already a Facebook before that one, and that person was told no because they couldn't see the vision. But then all of a sudden, someone who mirrors the investor, now they're able to see the vision. I do wonder, and I fully believe that Facebook was already in existence, but that person went through what you just described, where they were told no multiple times to the point where now they're questioning their self-worth. And I spent a lot of time working with founders around that until I realized, oh, this isn't a self-worth issue. This is a system issue. They never questioned their confidence before. They were fully invested in their own vision before these investors told them otherwise. So it's not about self-worth. It's not about self-esteem. We need to change the structure of the system so that these founders can stop thinking that they're the problem and get back to creating the brilliant products and services that we all want, even the investors that tell them no.
Exactly. And as a founder, you have a story, you have a why, you have a conviction for why you are doing, like your example, your first client having a mobile fashion truck. That's become a huge revolution. And especially I've seen vintage mobile fashion trucks now or secondhand, where the truck parks and then you can buy secondhand fashion, which is good for the environment or better for the environment. And there's always a why somebody wants to create something and solve a certain problem that they solve. So with this model that you're using, it really helps founders refine that story better, because they have to if they're going to attract the right investors that mirror that vision.
It helps them refine the story. I do want to say, overarching, it puts the power back in their hands because oftentimes they already knew the story to share. They already had that figured out. They have most founders that I work with have everything really figured out. It's the investors and the system that they're within that's making it so challenging. I want to go back to your Muse dating app example because when you look at the numbers, even back in 2017, you said that you were.
Yeah, it was a 2016, 2017 timeframe. Yeah.
So I vividly remember having a conversation with a gentleman in 2018 about the trajectory of dating apps, that it was a huge market. Investors were like clamoring to invest in the next dating app. So you already knew that. You already saw that. And lo and behold, just a couple of years later, we see a plethora of dating apps prop up with all of these investors behind it. So it wasn't that you didn't know, you knew the landscape. These investors that told you no also knew the landscape because even if they weren't in the dating pool, all of a sudden a year later they see the value in dating apps. No, they did know. There was something else at play. So what needs to then shift wasn't your story. It wasn't the product. It wasn't the business model. I don't even need to look at your business plan to know that it was all perfect. It was the power dynamic that needed to shift.
That, yes, without naming names, that tracks in many ways. I mean, and especially since I did have one woman investor advisor in the room once when I was running through one of the pitches, and she got it because she had founded 7 or 8 other companies in various areas. So she herself had been a founder of things that she found, scaled, and then sold and exited. And because she'd been in so many different industries, she saw a broader perspective than these men who probably were the number 2 employee at like Microsoft and made all their money that way, for example. But yes, that is very accurate. Absolutely. So we've talked about founders leading with authenticity and especially with fundraising where everything feels extremely performative. The pitch has to be structured a certain way. There's a format. How can founders maintain their authentic narratives while still speaking a language that investors understand?
Yes, authenticity from the founder's perspective, it really has to do with protecting your vision and understanding that there is a power dynamic at play. Sometimes when I talk to founders, depending on where they're at, if they're open to it, it really is a sexual energy exchange as well. And if they're open to seeing it that way, there's a lot of creativity that they can infuse in their process in order to ensure that they protect themselves. When we think about sex, protecting your own body, think of the vision, think of the business as an extension of the body. There's going to be certain conversations that you're not going to accept. There's going to be times when you're in a pitch situation, you realize maybe 15 minutes in, this isn't working, and you stop talking. Done.
Wow.
That is how you protect, though, your authenticity when you aren't diluting, when you aren't trying to fit into anyone's narrative, anyone's box, because then you dilute your brilliance, then you start to question what you're saying, then you start to doubt yourself, and there's a whole rabbit hole that happens after that. And so the more that founders can see this as a power dynamic, and if they're open to it, a sexual energy exchange, then they can get to a place of the authenticity is just, it's already there, and they don't have to worry about how they show up because it'll come through naturally.
That is awesome. Yeah, that's an important place to be. And imagine you rejecting as a founder an investor because you're like, no, this is not aligned. It's almost like turning down a job offer when you're unemployed, but you know that it's not aligned. There's still a strong position of power that one maintains when they can say no to an audience or a person that deems them as desperate. It's almost like you get that label put on you, like you're begging me for money. No, I mean, I'll still figure out a way. I've got with or without you energy, honey.
I'm so glad you said that. I did a program with the U.S. Department of State in Cyprus recently, and that question came up where it was a room of women founders, and one asked, well, what do I do when I know that the founder or the investor isn't in alignment, but I need the money? Like, I need the money. And that was my response. Say no. You are going to figure it out. And that's energy that is so scary to these investors who want you to fit into a box because the more you come from a place of sovereignty, the universe does align. And you've cleared the deck so that you can be met by the investor who is nourishing, who you don't have to explain, who you can speak in half sentences to, and they can fill in the gaps so that it makes sense to the metrics that they're looking for. You don't have to extend yourself as a founder. It takes courage because capital is needed, but the more you practice that muscle as a founder, it really does start to flow quite beautifully and elegantly.
Yes, definitely. I wanted to ask you about your time with the U.S. Department of State, but I did want to comment again on the with or without you energy because the idea behind this framework, I think it was Daniel Priestley that kind of coined this, where you're basically saying to somebody, I'm doing this thing. this thing is going to be big, monumental. My vision is to shift XYZ. Do you want in or do you not? It's not like, can you please invest in my thing, or can you please participate? It's more like, I'm doing this thing and I'm going to do it with or without you, but I'm giving you a chance. I'm opening the door to you if you want to participate. It's a different, like, you going back to power, it's a very different power shift. I've been applying that methodology to even like small things in my life where I have to ask for things, and it makes a massive difference in how you feel asking somebody for something, because even if they say no, I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to find a way.
I love that you said that too, to start small, because for a founder who's in this position, that can be a big ask to start with saying no to money. So start with the smaller aspects in your life. Whether, for me personally, I was in a dance class recently and I realized 10 minutes into the dance class that this isn't what I'm looking for right now. And so I said my version of no, which was leaving the class, and lo and behold, just down the way in the same building was a dance class that had the vibe that I was looking for. And so that could be, someone's version of a no. Just those little moments in your life where you realize, hey, you know what, this isn't quite what I want. Nothing wrong with the person, the situation in front of me. It's just not what I want. It's not in alignment. I'm going to say no to this. And then who knows what's waiting for you around the corner.
That is absolutely true. And I've had many experiences like that myself. So, anyone out there doubting themselves, just remember her method of quietly excusing oneself and the with or without you energy. So I want to zoom in for a moment, Danetha, on your work with the U.S. Department of State in the speaker program, because you'd mentioned you were speaking to entrepreneurs in Cyprus recently. You are promoting a concept that I absolutely love, and was even a finalist for the Robert Bosch Fellowship with this concept back in, I believe this was like 2018 going into 2019. Unfortunately, they did not pick my project, but it was on economic inclusion, financial inclusion globally. And for those of you not familiar with that topic, financial inclusion is where you're really looking at how ecosystems of financial products exclude and include certain groups of people. And we've seen many examples of that in the US, like women end up with higher mortgage rates, or at least they did a couple of years ago when I was looking at the numbers. And this is very unfortunate. And in countries outside of the US, the barrier to entry to the financial system is much, much higher and more difficult. So going outside of this country for a while, I lived in Silicon Valley, so you've worked out of Silicon Valley. How do different cultures narrate entrepreneurship and capital access? Like, what is their story on how they can be a founder, how they can get access to capital? Because I know, for example, in Europe, it's really not as easy as it is in the US.
Great questions. And I actually want to learn more about your project too. When it comes to economic inclusion, it's a wide lens. So my focus, like you said, is entrepreneurship, capital access. One thing that I love about the United States is our go-to attitude when it comes to capital. I know we just had a lovely conversation about all the barriers, but compared to other countries, our philosophy as Americans when it comes to funding vision is bar none. We are the bar. We have taken so many risks collectively to create a world around the American dream. Are there issues? Yes, we talked about some of them. But the American ethos around financing entrepreneurs is the masterclass in capital access. So when I go to other countries, the conversation is less about the storytelling and getting investors to see the beauty in heritage and legacy. That's actually present with most investors that I connect with. Even some founders, they see that investors are a little bit more open to that conversation than here in the States. The challenge is the investors having access to the sheer amount of capital that we have here in the United States, and also the willingness to take risks. So you brought up Germany as an example, or that you lived in Germany for some time. One of the programs that I did with the US Department of State was in Frankfurt and Stuttgart, Germany. And it was really eye-opening to me because when I would talk about heritage and legacy and beauty, the investors I was connecting with got it. And the German culture also has a love for precision.
Yes.
And some may say an intolerance for risk. I choose to say a love for precision. And so what that means is that there's a lot of regulatory frameworks that a founder has to go through before they can even ask investors for capital. That has to do with the cultural mindset, this willingness to take on risk without knowing what's going to happen. That's something that I'm still playing with. I'm moving to Italy in a couple of months. I'm living there permanently for the foreseeable future. And that's my next area in terms of the research that I do around economics. Gotten, I fully understand what's happening here in the United States, and now the European structure is where I want to dive more into because they get desire, they get passion. It's
Especially Italians. Yes.
especially Italian.
That's home of the luxury brands. You go to Milano and you're in the fashion houses that have those legacies, the family backing, all the dramatic stories, House of Gucci, for example. And yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked that question because that is a question that I'm going into this next era of my life with in terms of what is the breakdown when it comes to the European capital access model. I feel like it's more, yeah, it's something about the risk tolerance that we as Americans have honed and mastered, and I'm curious to see where that takes me.
Yeah, you're definitely right. It is the barrier to entry in terms of getting capital, even like seed funding for a new company in Europe is much more challenging. I know in Germany you have to start what's called a GmbH, like I guess it would be similar to an LLC in the US. You have to have a minimum of, when I was there, it was, I believe, 25,000 euros in initial capital, which for Americans, you're like, why? I
Right.
can I can start an LLC with $100 and put up a landing page and get 2,000 email addresses or 20,000 email addresses, and then go to an investor and say, "Hey, there's demand for my product," and then I get a couple million. It's just such a different world, and but the cultural, just the whole cultural structure around how people get funded is very, very different. So I was wondering how that those learnings have informed your work with luxury founders in this country in particular.
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought up that very specific example because that was a conversation I had with a couple of women from Germany where they helped me see that culturally, the Germans who left and came to the United States, they left. They ventured out into the unknown. The folks in Germany stayed. So they didn't venture out into the unknown. And this is a broad stroke, it's not everybody. But that is the overarching mindset that the unknown is scary. I'm not going to explore the possibility there. And that does flow into how they relate to capital and capital access and even the regulatory aspects around starting an LLC. Here in America, that is wild to think that I need 25K to get a piece of paper to start this idea that is something as Americans though that we've mastered. We are so comfortable with the unknown and trusting that it's going to be even better than we could have dreamed of. I'm curious to see from a policy perspective what shifts in Europe need to happen in order to start to cultivate and nourish that mindset.
Exactly. And that was part of the That was part of my proposal for the Bosch Fellowship, which I believe has now been discontinued. You had to submit a research proposal on what you were looking into. And because I was working in fintech at the time and that was heavily focused on financial inclusion, I wanted to see how having more restrictive funding access for entrepreneurs creates a different model of financial inclusion and more like financial disclusion, if you want to be honest. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to really dive into that because everybody wanted the like anti-Trump projects at the time that were looking at more national security issues than my outlier anomaly of fintech and financial inclusion. But nonetheless, it is something that I have certainly kept up with. So, is there a question in the course of our conversation that I should have asked you that I have not asked you yet about your work?
It's a question that I'm asking myself, so I don't have an answer, but I'd love to continue a conversation around what if legacy and equity were not at odds?
Interesting.
What,
Yeah.
yeah, what if the form, because oftentimes when I have conversations, they're seen as you've got to choose one over the other. Similar to folks that care about green energy, there used to be a conversation that, well, you had to choose the environment or making money. Thankfully, we're starting to see that those work together. But that's the crossroads that I see in the investor community now, where can I make money if I'm thinking about legacy? Or do I only have to think about legacy? I wonder what our world would look like if those weren't at odds.
Yeah, that's a good question. That really is. And I'm sure that's one that you will continue to answer throughout the course of everything you're exploring in Italy. That sounds really exciting. Which city are you moving to?
Milano.
Yeah, I knew it. Whenever you said you work with luxury brands, I thought she's got to be moving to Milano. That would make sense.
Yes.
What are you most looking forward to about this experience relocating?
Oh, wow. So the relocation is for my work, which is always driven by my personal desires. And my personal desire is to center my life around sensuality and passion. And that's what I'm most looking forward to, where it's not a question when I tell people that. It's almost a given that of course that's the center of your life. Now what? That's what I'm most looking forward to.
That is going to be very exciting, and I'm wishing you all the best on that journey. I do like to close these episodes with an important question that I ask everyone, which now I'm realizing I may have forgotten to ask my last guest this, but what narratives have you challenged lately, and what did you learn by challenging them?
I feel like I challenge narratives all the time. So one one that I'm
Good.
consistently challenging is this idea that pleasure and profit don't coexist. I fully believe that pleasure drives profit. I fully believe that desire drives the beautiful world that we all want to live in, regardless of your definition of beauty may be different from mine. But I fully believe that, and that is a narrative that I continue to push against.
That's interesting because we are always told when you're starting out as an entrepreneur, we're told find a pain point. Find Be the painkiller. You got to kill the pain. And then they're like, yeah, pain sells better than pleasure. And it's just like, I don't know about that because when people want, I mean, pleasure is very human, right? Pain reliever is like an emergency situation, but seeking fulfillment and pleasure and these things in life it's a very human quality to want to reach for that.
I'm so glad you said that because now I'm thinking pleasure points. That's what marketing and communications, which is your background, I wish there was more of that. I don't want to be reminded of my pain. In fact, I don't have any pain anymore. All I'm thinking about is pleasure.
Exactly. Yes. Like, let's be reminded how much we're suffering constantly so people can. There was an example in that show, Inventing Anna. I don't know if you've ever saw that on
I
Netflix.
have seen
I think it
that.
was Shonda Rhimes or Shonda Land that produced it.
Yeah.
But in terms of narratives, this person, for anyone who's not familiar with that show, built this entire persona around this belief that she was this heiress from Germany and that her money was stuck in Germany. And she was able to convince banks to give her millions in funding for this Anna Delvey Foundation idea that she had. She fooled just bamboozled New York's elite. And there's something fascinating about that or at least for me, somebody who studies narratives, that the power of a narrative like that can be so convincing that you won't look at facts. You just have that confirmation bias. And one of the things that in one of the scenes in the show, she's talking to an investor and she says, you're over 55 years old. Do you ever worry about dying? And he said, well, sure, I think about it, and she said, well, don't you think that, Pfizer or one of the pharmaceutical companies would like to know that so they could sell you Xanax? But she's playing on with that comment, she was sort of playing on how things are generally sold to us based on our anxieties or fear or struggle or pain, and not so much on our pleasure. But I do think pleasure sells. I'm right there with you. It definitely does.
It definitely does, and that's what we want. And I need to rewatch that movie because there's so much gold in what Anna uncovered. I actually wish she didn't have to do jail time because I fully loved. I mean, I don't advocate for bamboozling others. Let's just be very clear about that. What I do advocate though is selling a vision that investors want to back and a vision that's based on pleasure, which is what she did, and also questioning the system that those New York elite had bought into unconsciously.
That was also financial disclusion as well, because had they seen her in her normal form, they never would have invited her into those circles. But because she had the right narrative and the right look and the right appearance, the doors all opened automatically. That show, for anybody who has Netflix, is a great example of the power of narratives, for sure.
And it made me, oh my goodness, I could talk to you forever. I do feel that the outcome for her was based upon their embarrassment. It wasn't that they saw that what she did was bad, because there are lots of folks who build businesses that it's just fluff, and then eventually somehow it makes money eventually. But there's no reason why her foundation couldn't have eventually become something worth investing in. But they were embarrassed. And that was their projection onto this woman, that how dare you show that I'm the emperor with no clothes. How dare you?
Exactly. That's exactly 100%. Well, Danetha, I could talk to you forever as well. And I love this focus as somebody who has kind of, over the years, I'm like, should I revive my dating app? I don't know. But you've given me a lot of fodder for contemplation there with how to shift the narrative within myself, because I was kind of stuck in that old narrative based on my experiences. So for anyone founding anything, there is hope in Danetha's narrative. So definitely subscribe to that. That's for sure. Thank you so much for joining me on Narrative Dive, Danetha.
Thank you, Jessica. This has been such a lovely conversation.